Beattie ran a strange museum. He left behind an incredible collection of photographs.
G'day and welcome to Forgotten Tasmania. I'm John Stevenson. I'm fascinated with the 19th century. It was an age of discovery and invention, citizen scientists dreaming things into life. The age of Darwin, Lincoln, Napoleon, Victoria, Frankenstein, the Industrial Revolution, the telegraph and the camera. One of the great Tasmanian photographers of the 19th century was John Watt Beattie. My grandfather worked for Beattie and bought the business when Beattie died. I inherited Beattie's studio, and the Forgotten Tasmania video series is based on Beattie's photos. But who was John Watt Beattie? He was born in Scotland in 1856. I think the family had money because there are servants listed on the census at their address. But the story of how Beattie came to Tasmania is a real doozy. His father, John Beattie Sr., was an elder in the West Free Church in Aberdeen. Beattie Sr. was earning his living as a portrait photographer. The church features highly in his life, and a new minister was appointed against his wishes. The new guy wanted to play music in church, and the old man was so affected by this that he left the church and would have nothing more to do with it. His Scottish principles had been offended. He decided to uproot his family and move to the colonies to put enough distance between himself and that dreaded music. One night, while reading from a book about sheep farming in Australia, Beattie Sr. had an epiphany and decided to send young John, all of 22 at the time, to spy out the land and find them a new home on the other side of the world. The dutiful son arrived in Melbourne, but was soundly told that times were bad and sheep farms were going broke.
Dear Father, I must confess I was a little sorry to have all our fine dreams of settlement knocked to atoms. But I have just told you exactly what I was told myself, and it wouldn't do for me to hide all these things from you, and to bring you out here to be, God forbid, ruined. He said Tasmania is not the place to settle in with a view to better yourself, and the price of manual labour was very high just now. A man gets some £40 to £50 per year all found, which he says eats up all the profits. He said it was all very well for the old colonialists to thrive, because they had the benefit of having convict labourers, which only cost them £9 per year all found, and they were splendid workers.
Nothing would sway Beattie Sr., so out to Tasmania they came.
So in 1879, this wall wasn't here. This is part of the Willow Court complex that was built later. In fact, this was a property and the fence was here, and just around the corner here would have been a property called Murray Hall, which was where the Beattie family first moved in 1879. Finding the exact location of the house is pretty tricky because it was pulled down and then another house was built there and then they pulled that one down in 1928. But I think this is the spot. The house would have been back a little bit from, this would have been the property line and the house would have been back a bit from that. But yeah, this is where the Beattie family lived and they farmed sheep up on Mount Lloyd, which is just over that way.
He made a photographic expedition to Lake St Clair. He borrowed his father's horse, hired a mail cart, and with two other gentlemen they set off for the lake. He was using a new photographic process that had just come out. The gelatin silver or dry plate system was much more portable than the older wet plate system. There was no need to carry chemicals in a darkroom tent, and the film lasted much longer. But this was no point and shoot. Beattie had to understand the light, the emulsion, the chemistry, and every aspect of the process, and the camera weighed 27 kilos, even without the glass plate film. One of the men, Mr Alex Riddick, offered to put up £200 to start John in business if he'd come to Hobart. John declined that offer. His time on the farm made young John Watt Beattie grow up fast. I get the feeling that the history of Port Arthur had a great impact on him. He had first-hand access to men who'd been prisoners at Port Arthur, because the workers on the farm were former convicts.
I was soaked in lore and the romance of Port Arthur.
In 1882, one of the Anson brothers made the long journey from Hobart Town to Murray Hall by horse and cart, and they offered John a position in the photographic studio. John accepted and moved to Hobart to make his fortune. Around this time, John's father and most of the family went back to Scotland, but they'd visit Tasmania again. John worked for the Ansons until 1891, when he bought out the last surviving brother and renamed the business to Beattie Studio. Over 130 years later, the business is still operating under that name. As well as the Anson brothers' body of work, Beattie also received the photographic archives of previous photographers, like Samuel Clifford and Charles Woolley. Beattie had success almost immediately he took over the business. He moved from the small building in Elizabeth Street to Claiborne House in Murray Street, a 3-storey building to house his museum, library and a huge studio that could hold 80 people. There were separate laboratories for chemicals and daylight printing on the roof. It was a serious enterprise. Beattie became a prolific wilderness photographer long before anybody coined that term.
I have been essentially an outdoor man. I love the bush and nothing gives me greater delight than to stand on some high land and look out on a wild array of our giant mountains.
Beattie's cousin Jack Cato claims Beattie regarded the West Coast as his true home. Beattie photographed most of it. He may not have been the first to all of it, but he's certainly the most well known, and more of his work has survived than any of the other photographers of his time. He married Emily Cox Cato on the 28th of October 1886 in Hobart. His father and family came out from Scotland to celebrate. In 1895, their first daughter, Jean Franklin Beattie, was born, and followed in 1898 by their second daughter, Muriel Denison Beattie. Franklin and Denison being names of former governors of Tasmania. Beattie kept a museum and a lending library. This didn't sit well with everyone. I recall reading a letter to the newspaper from a visitor to the state who lamented the private ownership of such a fine collection of Tasmanian artefacts. What they missed was that Beattie was the one who bought them when the government wanted to get rid of them. Beattie promoted Port Arthur, collecting relics in a time when Tasmanians wanted to forget or hide our state's convict past. Having a convict in your ancestry, known as the hated stain of convictism, was something to be ashamed of. In 1921, Beattie spoke out against the destruction of records. He acquired pardons, tickets of leave and other documents. In 1926, during the making of the film For the Term of His Natural Life, the Attorney General, Mr. A.G. Ogilvie, even suggested that the censorship board should ban the screening of the film. Records of the convict past were suppressed until the 1970s. I have dozens of pardons and original documents, thanks to the Beattie collection. Beattie was a patron of the arts and an art collector. He purchased paintings by Gould, Forrest and other noted painters of the day. He worked closely with Horton Forrest, commissioning paintings of the past to recreate things he couldn't photograph. Beattie was an early tourism promoter. He was in the right place at the right time. There was a lack of photos to go with the wonderful things that were being written and said about Tasmania. This created the perfect market conditions, and Beattie worked that market well. Beattie was a founding member of the Tasmanian Tourism Board, a member of the Royal Society of Tasmania, a member of the Minerva Club, a member of the Field Naturalist Club, and a charter member of the Hobart Lodge of the Theosophical Society. It seems he was interested in everything from science and history to the occult. Before there were movies, Beattie had a travelling slideshow. He made lantern slides of some of his old photos and toured the state giving talks he'd written, illustrated with the slides. At least 6 different talks are known, and I have booklets that went with them. The lantern slides spread all around the world, and they're very common in Britain. Beattie's photos were used on Tasmanian postage stamps from 1899 to 1912. 8 stamps were made, 5 of which had Beattie photos. They were used to promote the state and tourism. He'd become such an expert on the West Coast that the Tasmanian Parliament paid him to answer members' questions on matters of road and rail planning, water and timber resources and the likes. Beattie was a conservationist, speaking out against industrial development on the West Coast. In a paper to Parliament in 1908, Beattie says,
"Apart from the aesthetic side of the Gordon's attractions, its scientific aspect as contributing a unique display of our West Coast flora must become apparent to all and should alone warrant beyond question its rigid protection against axe and fire."
His lobbying efforts were successful in protecting the banks of the Gordon River. He was also in favour of exploring for minerals. This is an interesting balance and not something we have right even today. In 1906, Beattie set off on the Southern Cross to explore the Pacific. He spent 3 months at sea and returned with thousands of photos. He visited numerous islands such as Mare, Rega, the Torres Islands, Vanuatu and Fiji. Of note was his brief stop in the Solomons, where he visited the Lever Brothers plantation and met some ladies named Kitchen. These names stand out because Lever and Kitchen became Unilever, one of the biggest 3 soap companies in the world today. In 1911, Roald Amundsen won the race to be the first to the South Pole. He sailed to Hobart, and the only man he'd trust to process his historic photo was John Watt Beattie. The only known surviving print is in the National Library and made by Beattie himself. We have copies of the negatives in the collection today. Beattie recognised the Tasmanian Aboriginals and lamented their fate at the hands of European settlers.
For about 30 years, this ancient people held their ground bravely against the invaders of their beautiful domain.
Beattie wasn't perfect. His purchase and marketing of photos under his own name, when he hadn't taken them himself, upset some people. I don't think Beattie ever claimed to have taken the photos, just that he owned them. Beattie wasn't into self-promotion or driving his business out of the reach of the ordinary customer. Much of Beattie's story is told by Jack Cato, who even suggests that Robert Louis Stevenson may have been inspired to write Treasure Island after seeing Beattie's work. Beattie's health seems to have declined around 1925, and he approached Arch Stevenson, a portrait photographer working for Van Dyck's studio in Launceston. Arch moved the family to Hobart, joined Beattie's studio, and went on to purchase the business in 1933. It's been in the Stevenson family ever since. The 1927 sale of the Beattie Museum was a long-winded, politically charged affair. Launceston decided to invest in the collection to attract tourists. It was eventually broken up into 2 main parts, one going to the Queen Victoria Museum. Hobart refused to purchase the remaining collection for numerous reasons, until later when a benefactor provided funds to TMAG. On the 24th of June 1930, John Beattie visited the Cato household before leaving to meet up with his wife at another friend's house in Sandy Bay. Shortly after arriving there, he collapsed in a chair and passed away, an apparent heart attack. He was 71. He's buried at Cornelian Bay Cemetery. There are history books that say Beattie's collection was totally destroyed by a fire in 1933, but that's not true. There are 2 shipping containers full of darkroom and photographic equipment, enlargers, cameras, lights, and of course the original negatives, and lots of that stuff dates before 1933. I rest my case. One day I hope to reopen Beattie's museum, showing his collection of photos and all the equipment he left behind. In the meantime, about half of the photos have been digitised, and they're available free of charge at beattiestudio.com. As I explore the stories behind the photos, I make documentaries that you can watch for free on YouTube, and read the notes and research at forgottentasmania.com. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button to train YouTube so it can show you more videos that you might like. If you have more information or I missed something, please put it in the comments below. You can see all the research, links, references and photos from this episode on our website, forgottentasmania.com/episode/307. All the Beattie's digitised photos are on the website beattiestudio.com, and there are displays of Beattie's photos for sale at Winnings News Agency, 317 Elizabeth Street, North Hobart, and Sorel Antiques, 15 Somerville Street, Sorel. Thanks for watching. Cheers.